nearly a century, the name of Hurley, Wisconsin would conjure images of brothels, illegal gambling joints, free-flowing booze, and unchecked violence. The little town would be synonymous with corruption and sin. It would become the most infamous little town in America. Throughout its history, its tales of misdeeds were front-page news, captivating an entire generation. The line of truth and fantasy was often crossed by writers of books, magazines, and articles. For good or for bad, Hurley would embed itself into the American conscience. From the first steps of the French on this virgin land, it would be declared uninhabitable. Huge stands of tall timbers and thick brush stood to impede the exploration of French priests who came to civilize the native Indians. The land known as the Chippewa territories was considered hostile, impassable, and worthless. By the end of the 17th century, the mouth of the Montreal River was considered nothing more than a campsite. The region would remain isolated and unexplored for more than a century. By 1800, the French would establish a fort and trading post some 50 miles into the interior of this land. The Lac du Flambeau fort was managed by Francois Malloy, who would later write in his journal, "Of all the spots and places I've seen on earth, this is the most horrid." 1833 saw John Jacob Astor's American Fur Trading Company establish a trading post and fort at the mouth of the Montreal River. This would be the closest thing to civilization for the next half a century. Mineral explorations of the region known as the Pewabic would begin as early as 1822. By 1845, small deposits of copper were discovered, along with indications of iron ore. In a typesetting error, the name Pewabic was misspelled. The name of the region was now Panoke, and would remain forever. The Panoke Range would extend west to the Bad River and east to the Montreal. Geological surveyors would conclude that iron ore was concentrated primarily on the western end of the Panoke. Their conclusion was based on the strong magnetic field surrounding the ore on the western end. By compass readings, they concluded the eastern end of the Panoke would contain little iron ore and be of little value to prospectors and investors. Ironically, the type of hematite ore that lies under the eastern end of the Panoke Range is virtually non-magnetic, delaying the discovery of one of the largest deposits of iron ore in the world by almost 4 decades. In 1871, a Harvard geology professor, Raphael Pumpelly, working for several Boston businessmen, would explore the eastern side of the Montreal River in the region known as the Gogebic. In October of that year, Pumpelly would discover large rock formations, and in particular yellow spots, indicating a concentration of iron oxide. Although Pumpelly himself didn't think much of his discovery, he returned to Marquette, Michigan, and purchased the land for his Boston investors. It would not be for another 10 years that exploration would continue. But this single discovery would refute all claims that the eastern end of the Panoke and the western end of the Gogebic ranges were void of valuable iron ore. More than a decade later, in 1882, large deposits of iron ore would be discovered on the eastern side of the Montreal River. It was concluded that the Gogebic and Panoke iron ranges were in reality one and the same, and would later only be known as the Gogebic Iron Range. The discovery would touch off a rush of prospectors and investors. Within 1 year, mining camps sprang from the wilderness, and prospecting had begun in every section of land on both the Wisconsin and Michigan sides on the Montreal River. By 1882, word of iron ore finds were increasing, and several small camps were established in what is now known as the town of Hurley. In 1879, the Lake Superior Ship, Canal, and Railroad Company purchased a huge tract of land on the Wisconsin-Michigan border. In 1883, this land was to become the town of Vaughan. Vaughan Township was organized and became the largest township in the state of Wisconsin. The town of Vaughan would consume a huge area and was originally organized under Ashland County. With only a few small mining camps, the Lake Superior Ship, Canal, and Railroad Company planned to plat this new district. But in the spring of 1884, a legal battle ensued. The Northern Chief Iron Mining Company would sue for the rights to purchase and plat this property for itself. The lawyer for the Northern Chief Iron Mining Company was a prominent attorney from Wausau, Wisconsin. On October 15, 1884, Michael Angelo Hurley would win his case. He would ask no fee for his legal services. Rather, M.A. Hurley would ask that the new town be named after him. And so it was. The town would become Glen Hurley. Glen, his nickname, was dropped in 1885, and the little village would forever be known as Hurley. Although the newspapers of the day would report his service as an act of kindness, his intentions were not entirely altruistic. M.A. Hurley would have large stock holdings in the Northern Chief Iron Mining Company, later making a small fortune for his act of kindness. In late 1884, the town of Hurley was nothing more than a few crude structures fashioned out of logs and tents. The population was no more than 300. Merchants, as well as miners, were beginning to migrate into this new area. The open pits of the Germania, Cary, and Montreal mines were being replaced with vertical shafts. The huge veins of ore were deep, but extremely large and profitable. The mines were on the verge of shipping their first loads of ore. Huge stockpiles stood in anticipation of the railroad. By 1885, the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western Railway would reach the Gogebic Range from Watersmeet, Michigan. The railroad would complete its line to the port city of Ashland, Wisconsin, by year's end, and the Germania mine would be given credit for providing the first load of iron ore from the Gogebic Range. But the trains that would carry valuable iron ore would also carry another load, and by the spring of 1886, Hurley would grow from 300 to 3,000. Hurley's population had increased tenfold in 6 short months, and the new immigrants were arriving every day. The Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western Railway refused at first to make a passenger stop at Hurley, stopping only at Ironwood. But political pressure, coupled with passenger demands, led the railroad to build Hurley's first railway depot. Hurley was no longer a little mining settlement in the woods, but a full-fledged town. Buildings were being constructed as fast as the wood became available. Lumbering and mining men throughout the Midwest would answer the cry for labor. The Montreal, Cary, and Germania mines would now employ more than 4,000 men. The lumbering industry was expanding. New buildings were being constructed every day to meet the demands of this growing population. The mines themselves would consume large quantities of wood used for shoring and timbering. The new residents of Hurley would need boarding houses, hotels, restaurants, and homes. Lumber mills sprang up from the dense forests, employing thousands of lumberjacks from across the Midwest. Entrepreneurs would flock to Hurley, starting new businesses. Hurley would become the center of commerce for the Gogebic Range. By the spring of 1887, Hurley would develop from a rough, crude village of a few hundred people to a boomtown of 7,000. In 1840, the boundary between Michigan and Wisconsin was recognized. Although original survey maps indicate the actual boundary was the west branch of the Montreal River, the surveyor, T.J. Cram, mistakenly identified the east branch of the Montreal as the border. The border dispute would not erupt for another 4 decades. In 1885, upon hearing of the great iron ore finds in the western end of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, coupled with rumors of a misplaced border, the state of Michigan resurveyed the Michigan-Wisconsin border. It was their conclusion that in fact the border was the west branch of the Montreal River, giving the state of Michigan 600 square miles of some of the richest iron ore deposits in the world. The state of Michigan would request this land from Wisconsin, citing a border miscalculation, and Wisconsin would choose to ignore the request. In an ironic twist, the land that no one wanted a decade earlier would now become hotly contested property. The dispute would continue for almost half a century, both sides hurling insults and placing blame on the surveyor. One account read, "It is widely known that T.J. Cram was given to fits of drunkenness. We should consider ourselves lucky to have a border at all." By 1921, Michigan had already annexed some 260 square miles of Wisconsin property by a state constitutional amendment. But Wisconsin protested and would not recognize Michigan's claim. The dispute was finally settled by the United States Supreme Court in 1923. It was the court's decision that the border between Michigan and Wisconsin, although miscalculated, had been the east branch of the Montreal River for over 80 years and would remain so. By 1885, Hurley would continue to prosper. Lots in the city would sell for as much as $1,500. Land agent for the Northern Chief Iron Mining Company was a man who would gain distinction for having the town across the border named after him. James Iron Wood would also be Hurley's first elected chairman and first postmaster in April of 1885. Word of great iron ore finds were spreading throughout the Midwest. Investors rushed to the north woods of Wisconsin. Few would make their fortunes on the Gogebic Range, but some, like John Burton, would amass a fortune. He would come from Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, already a wealthy man. John Burton would invest heavily in several iron mining companies. Burton would be responsible for high-producing iron mining properties on the Gogebic Range. His investments in the First National, Iron King, Geneva, Pabst, and Bonney mines would make him a fortune. The Bonney Iron Mining Company, one of Burton's smaller properties, would have on its stock certificate a photograph of a little girl, Bonnie, John Burton's daughter. But John Burton would not only invest in iron mines, he was responsible for building one of the most lavish hotels in the Midwest, the hotel with 1,000 windows, the Burton House. Constructed for the astronomical sum of $100,000, John Burton would spare no expense in its design, complete with Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers, imported stone, and carved oak ornamentation. The Burton House was completed in late summer of 1886. The grand opening was considered a lavish affair and was attended by prominent figures of Wisconsin, including Governor Rusk. As one newspaper account read, the festivities continued until dawn, and most guests, at least the ones left standing, were relieved of their senses. The Burton House would remain a fixture of Hurley for the next 60 years. John Burton would continue to invest heavily in iron mining properties, but these new properties were worthless, producing little or no iron ore. Accumulating tremendous debt, coupled with a disastrous fire wiping out most of his properties in the business district, Burton would lose the fortune he'd amassed, selling off his entire holdings of iron-producing properties on the Gogebic Range, and eventually selling the Burton House for 3 million canceled postage stamps. Another prominent investor in the area was Nat Moore. He, along with his business partner H.S. Benjamin, would own the iron mining properties of the Aurora, Vaughan, Sunday Lake, and Colby mines. but the same fate awaited them as did John Burton. By 1887, Moore and Benjamin invested heavily in non-iron producing properties. Taking massive losses, they were forced to sell their holdings on the Gogebic Range. Moore, Benjamin, and Burton would all leave the Gogebic Range, never to return. They all died in relative obscurity. On July 9th of 1887, the Alcazar Theater, a popular entertainment spot boasting the bright stage lights and the area's largest group of girls, was the scene of Hurley's most horrific fire. The fire started in the stage scenery and quickly spread to the decorations and tinder-dry wood-frame building. Those close to the door made their escape, but for those trapped upstairs, escape became impossible as the building was engulfed in a few short minutes. Some jumped from the upstairs windows, causing broken bones and fatalities. All told, 11 would die. The blaze would quickly spread down Silver Street, consuming most of Hurley's business district, until there was nothing left to burn. Hurley was left in ashes. The Burton House, one of a handful of buildings left standing, was saved by employees and guests placing wet blankets on the exterior of the building. Hurley had suffered a tragic loss. Like other range communities that had been touched by the fire demon, as it was called, Hurley would survive and rebuild. On the very spot where once stood the Alcazar Theater was built a new structure. This now housed the Klondike Theater. As fate would have it, 14 years later, in 1901, the Klondike would also be consumed by fire, killing 10. Hurley was born from inauspicious beginnings. The first recorded death in Hurley, a suicide. One of the first buildings in town, a tavern. And the first pastor of the community, Reverend Verwist, would quit after only 6 months, declaring the town unsavable and ungodly. By 1885, Hurley's reputation was larger than the town itself. Newspaper accounts of Hurley would be popular reading material for the entire Midwest. The first newspaper on the range, the Gogebic Explorer from Bessemer, Michigan, was first circulated June 4, 1885. It quickly established a pattern of yellow journalism that would continue for decades. The Explorer would trumpet the prospects of the Gogebic Range, and in particular Bessemer, but was very quick to attack the saloon life and devoted extensive coverage to area violence, going so far as to publish a weekly column, Deeds of Blood, primarily about conditions at Hurley. The Explorer, although only lasting 15 weekly issues, was printed in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee press was quick to pick up the articles, and Hurley would soon become a favorite target for downstate press.
All aboard! Hurley, Hayward, and help!
Little did the conductor on the train of the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western know, on one particular trip to the Wisconsin North Woods, that his catchy phrase would be immortalized for almost a century. Hurley, as it was written, was one of the 3 worst places on earth, and Hurley would be the worst of the 3. By 1890, Hurley was famous for its Silver Street life. 80 taverns, 50 gambling parlors, and over 200 prostitutes plied their wares in saloons, theaters, and social clubs. Hurley's reputation of being a wide-open city would continue well into the 20th century. But in reality, Hurley was no different than any other boom town of that era. Lumberjacks and miners were willing and able to spend their paychecks in Hurley's establishments. Wisconsin law made it easy to provide these services to jacks and miners, while across the river in Michigan, liquor establishments were restricted to 1 for every 500 residents. Wisconsin law provided 1 license for every 50. Prostitution and gambling were considered immoral, but nonetheless legal enterprises. It didn't take long for entrepreneurs to realize the potential of the Silver Street business. By 1895, the iron mines of the Gogebic were producing more iron ore than ever before. Lumber camps in the woods would now number in the hundreds, and business was good on Silver Street. But the stories of Hurley were a mix of reality and fantasy. Some reports were blatant lies, while others were based in truth. The press of the day often had difficulty distinguishing between fact and fiction. Hurley was, during the 80s, the toughest town in the United States. Its dance halls were the vilest. Its gambling dens were the crookedest. Its traffic of vice the most glaring, and its bad characters the most dangerous in the West. It was Hurley that fostered the stockades, where kidnapped women were fenced within a large enclosure and guarded with rifles and bloodhounds against chance of escape by the masters who made an infamous living from their slavery. A crusade started that tore down the stockades, liberated the women, and forever put an end to the cruelest blot on the history of the developing Northwest, perhaps the foulest in all American history. Manitowoc Pilot, May 5, 1898. Although it made for interesting reading, the rumors of kidnapped women being held in stockades were unsubstantiated. This well-worn story was previously told about several California communities during the gold rush of 1849. The truth about Hurley was outrageous enough without tall tales. Hurley would have its share of drunken brawls, crooked gambling parlors, robberies, and murders. The most infamous murder on the Gogebic Range occurred in Hurley on April 11th of 1890. Lotta Morgan, a 28-year-old prostitute and entertainer, was found in an alley behind a saloon, her head split open with an axe, and, as a newspaper reported, carried a bullet. She was one of 200 prostitutes in the city of Hurley, and some would speculate a lover's quarrel, while others were convinced she knew too much. Lotta Morgan's apartment was directly opposite the Iron Exchange Bank, which was robbed at night several months earlier. It is speculated Lotta Morgan may have seen who the perpetrators were. Her funeral was held at the Opera House and was attended by well-established members of the community, clergymen, and fellow working girls. More than 1,000 people would attend her service. Her murder remains a mystery. Lotta Morgan would be buried under her real name, Laura Whitley, on April 14, 1890, her 29th birthday. But Lotta Morgan's life and name would be immortalized in Edna Ferber's book, Come and Get It. The book became so popular, curiosity seekers and souvenir hunters have chipped away at Lotta's gravestone. Now, over a century later, only a few pieces of rubble remain, and Lotta Morgan lies in an unmarked grave. Newspapers would prey on the murder statistics of Hurley, but murder wasn't responsible for most violent deaths. The great iron mines of the Gogebic Range were the most dangerous iron mines in the world. 5.6 deaths were recorded for every 1,000 miners. Soft geological formations, wet conditions, and fire proved to be factors in mining fatalities. The safety of the miners was not a high priority for mining companies. Labor was cheap and plentiful. By the time the Gogebic Range ceased operation in 1966, it is estimated that in both Iron and Gogebic counties over 2,000 men had died and over 20,000 had been severely injured. "1915 saw another boom on the Gogebic Range. The build-up prior to World War I was massive. The need for steel was insatiable, as the United States war machine prepared for inevitable conflict with Germany. The mines of the Gogebic were running at full capacity. The steel mills of Cleveland and Pittsburgh demanded more ore. A strike by organized labor on the Mesaba Iron Range of Minnesota left the brunt of the production to the Gogebic Range. The Gogebic responded and produced more ore than ever before. The Montreal mine, a year earlier, had produced 800,000 tons, but this year it would double its output to almost 1.5 million tons of iron ore. The Montreal mine would become the deepest underground iron mine in the world, with 43 levels and reaching a depth of 4,377 feet. On April 1st, 1918, Hurley would officially become a city. Its first mayor, Henry Meade, would set a pattern that would continue for 6 decades. Although Meade himself found saloon life, prostitution, and gambling distasteful, he realized the economic impact of these establishments. 6 years earlier, in 1912, the germanium mine had closed, reducing the Hurley tax base by as much as $3 million and costing 1,000 jobs. By 1920, the population had climbed to 45,000 people on the Boogibic Range. A portion of those would be single men, and Hurley would become the entertainment capital of the North.
I consider Hurley the Sodom and Gomorrah of this peaceful North Country. I read the newspapers about its gambling, whores, and saloons. I am quite astonished by its blatant disregard for decency. Being a Christian man, I cannot condone the antics of the town across the river. Still, I am fitfully aware that men from my mine cross the river to this den of thieves with paycheck in hand. They do come back, penniless, eager to work. Too poor to listen to union rhetoric. Perhaps I should consider Hurley a blessing, yet I'm caught in a quandary. My Christian beliefs are the good of the company that pays my salary.
Captain Robert Moore, East Norrie Mine, March 13, 1918. On January 19, 1919, Prohibition was enacted. But prior to the 18th Amendment, temperance societies were well organized and substantial. By 1917, both Michigan and Wisconsin had passed Sunday closing laws, prohibiting the sale of liquor on Sunday. Michigan adhered closely to the law, but Hurley ignored it. Nothing was to interrupt one of Hurley's principal businesses. While Michigan dried up on Sundays, Hurley's businesses would boom. Saloons would pay nothing more than lip service to the law, while some would close until noon. Others would lock the front door, leaving the back door open. In February of 1918, Wisconsin Governor Phillip would issue special orders to enforce Sunday closings in Hurley. But the closings were effective for only as long as government agents were in town. Saloon keepers adopted a new ruse: soft drink parlors. Saloons continued their normal hours and activities without booze until the agents were gone. Then it was back to business, and the booze flowed once again. Michigan newspapers would be adamant about their disdain for Hurley, claiming that $15,000 of Michigan's citizens' money was spent every Sunday in Hurley, and a special train was running from Michigan towns to the famous booze-guzzling city. But Hurley would refute these claims.
This will certainly be news to local saloon keepers to learn that $15,000 is being spent every Sunday in Hurley saloons. They're pretty sure that the laboring men on the range haven't $15,000 to spend.
The Montreal River Miner, 1918. Though Prohibition was in full force, Hurley largely ignored the edict. Hardly a week would pass without mention of bootlegging or moonshining in the local press. By 1920, the federal government would become deeply involved in shutting down the lucrative bootlegging trade. Although Hurley would consider the 18th Amendment not worth the paper it was written on, federal agents were not amused by Hurley's blatant disregard for the law. The battle between federal agents and Hurley saloon keepers would escalate into all-out war in 1920. The conflict would erupt in gunfire on a road between Hurley and Mercer. For weeks, several Hurley and Ironwood men planned a buying trip to Milwaukee, where booze was plentiful, good, and bonded. A man from Marquette, Michigan, would join their party, John Fillion. Fillion was an undercover federal agent. His superior, Leo Grove, was now informed of this trip to Milwaukee and of the group's route. On the evening of October 9th, Leo Grove and 5 other agents lay in wait for the caravan returning from Milwaukee, each car loaded with cases of booze. Just north of Mercer, they would set their roadblock. The 2 lead cars of the caravan, traveling at high speed, were unable to stop. The first car crashed the roadblock and swerved into a ditch. The second car cleared the roadblock and headed north amidst a hail of gunfire. After a lone rifle shot, the car swerved and slowed to a stop. Its driver, John Chapuzio, owner of the Senate Hotel in Hurley, was found slumped over the wheel, shot in the back. The late-night confrontation would be one of many in the Wisconsin North Woods, but this particular incident would come under severe scrutiny. Strangely, the agents made no attempt to aid the wounded Chapuzio, and no contact was made with local authorities. Agents quickly deputized a southbound motorist and sent Chapuzio north to an Ironwood hospital. Chapuzio would die the next afternoon. A coroner's inquest was called in Iron County to investigate the shooting. On October 25, 1920, the shooting was declared unjustified. Leo Grove and 5 other federal agents were indicted for the murder of John Chapuzio. The agents were residents of Illinois and Michigan. The Iron County District Attorney was powerless to bring them to Wisconsin to stand trial. The agents would never again return to Wisconsin. A trial would never be held, and Hurley citizens, embittered toward federal agents, would offer little or no assistance in curbing the flow of illegal booze. Federal agents planned to choke off the supply line of booze coming into Hurley, but the routes used by the rum runners were too numerous and too unknown to outsiders. Soon the federal government would switch its plan. Instead of choking off supply, they would now attack the saloons. On December 28, 1920, 3 days before New Year's, a group of 50 heavily armed federal agents arrived in Hurley on the morning train from Chicago. Federal warrants were issued by Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. 57 saloon operators and bartenders were arrested for liquor violations. Fearing retaliation, the 57 were hastily transported to Ashland, Wisconsin. Ashland County Court set a minimum bond. Within hours, all 57 were released. A change of venue was requested by the federal prosecutor. It was felt Iron County would never convict its own citizens. The case would drag on for years. Most of the 57 hired prominent attorney J.A. O'Neill from Ironwood. His contention that the search warrants were illegal was brought before federal judge Claude Z. Luce. Judge Luce would side with O'Neill and rule the search warrants illegal, rendering all evidence invalid. On April 6, 1923, a federal grand jury would convene. Without evidence, the grand jury dismissed all charges. Of the 57 who were arrested in the raid of 1920, not one was ever prosecuted. Once again, the federal agents would alter their plans. Cutting off the booze supply was a disaster and an embarrassment. Arresting saloon owners and bartenders was useless. The only option was to physically close down the saloons. On New Year's Eve of 1926, federal agents would once again raid Hurley. This time, agents would be armed with temporary restraining orders, closing 29 saloons. The disregard for the Volstead Act was widespread. Of the 29 saloons padlocked, one was owned by a Hurley police officer. Another was owned by a contender for the office of sheriff in Iron County. This time there would be no arrests, no fines, and no imprisonments. The only action was to padlock the saloons for 1 year. But without local support from police and court officials of Iron County, the injunctions were useless. As soon as the agents were on the train, the padlocks were gone, and business on Silver Street was once again back to normal. During the Prohibition years, bootlegging was considered a legitimate business. Nothing could curb the thirst for good booze and women. Miners and lumberjacks would continue to spend their money in Hurley. Fortresses were built for the explicit purpose of manufacturing and storing of beer and booze. The first villa, built in 1924, was built expressly for this purpose. It featured 3 basements where booze could be hidden from federal regulators. It also had 2-foot-thick walls made of stone for protection and was topped with a green-glazed, fireproof tile roof. Throughout Prohibition, federal agents tried desperately to shut down the illegal booze traffic and illicit vice of Hurley. They were met with indifference from local authorities. Hurley would remain Hurley, regardless of laws and lawmen. Silver Street would continue on as it had for almost 50 years. I think of Hurley as a festering sore. It just never seems to go away. We raid establishments one week, and days later we get information that the same place is reopened. We have neither the manpower nor the resources to consistently keep Hurley in check. The local law winks their eyes at these saloon keepers. We know most are paid quite handsomely for their friendship. We can do little about it. It seems as though Hurley is a large anthill. For every ant we kill, 10 new ants take its place. Federal Agent John Stiles, Chicago office, 1927. On St. Valentine's Day, 1929, Al Capone took over all bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling operations in Chicago. His vicious behavior brought him to the pinnacle of the underworld. It's estimated that at the height of Prohibition, Capone's organization would bring in some $3 million a week. Although Capone would make many trips to Hurley, it was primarily for enjoyment and not business. Capone's organization would have no control over Hurley. Its businesses were firmly established, and Capone would show no interest in gaining a percentage of the booze trade. But Capone would find interest in the more than 200 working girls of Hurley. Some were recruited as shills and pickpockets, while others were recruited as prostitutes. Hurley would see a constant flow of girls leave to the Capone organization in Chicago. In return, Hurley would come under the protection of the Capone organization. Although only indirectly involved, Capone had enough clout to place pressure on elected officials, judges, and high-ranking law officers of the state of Wisconsin to turn a blind eye on the activities of Hurley. Without help from local and state authorities, the federal government stood no chance of gaining control and shutting down the lucrative booze, prostitution, and gambling businesses of Hurley. Al Capone would be imprisoned in 1931 for income tax evasion. His brother Ralph, who controlled the vast booze distribution system, would also be sent to prison. Paroled in 1934, Ralph, who would also be known as Bottles, would eventually make his home in Mercer, Wisconsin. Al Capone, while still in prison, continued to run his empire. Stricken with neurosyphilis, he was paroled in 1939. Capone's disease had ravaged his brain. He was no longer able to run the empire he had built out of bloodshed and murder. Alphonse Capone would die without fanfare at Miami Beach in 1947. Ralph would operate several taverns and gambling joints in the Wisconsin North Woods. He would never again achieve the wealth he had once had. Ralph Bottles Capone died in a nursing home in Hurley, Wisconsin in 1974. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment of the Constitution was ratified and the Volstead Act was repealed. Booze was once again legal. Hurley would close another chapter in its illustrious history. But it wouldn't be its last. Hurley's bitterness toward federal agents would be fueled by an incident that occurred April 22, 1934, some 20 miles south of Hurley in Mercer, Wisconsin. John Dillinger, a generous customer of the Hurley saloons, was caught in a shootout with the FBI at the Little Bohemia Lodge, just south of Mercer. Details at first were sketchy, but as news of the incident became known, anger and distrust filtered through Hurley. In the early morning hours of April 22nd, the newly revamped Federal Bureau of Investigation, now empowered to carry automatic weapons, trapped the FBI's public enemy number one, John Dillinger, at a lodge south of Mercer. Little Bohemia would be the site of one of the FBI's biggest embarrassments of the 1930s. Having received a tip about Dillinger's whereabouts, federal agents flew to Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and drove to Manitowish Waters, setting up headquarters at Voss's Resort a few miles south of Little Bohemia. The agents were supervised by Melvin Purvis from the Chicago field office. By 9 p.m., the agents surrounded Little Bohemia on 3 sides. It was thought the back of the lodge was on the lake and needed no surveillance. At 10:30 p.m., the agents witnessed 3 figures hop in a car parked at the lodge. The car proceeded down the long driveway. Fearing Dillinger's escape, the agents, hiding in the pines, fired on the car. Riddled with bullets, the vehicle swerved to a stop. The agents quickly discovered that the men in the car were not the notorious Dillinger gang, but 3 locals. 2 were wounded, and 1 was dead. By the time the commotion had stopped and the FBI had realized that these men were not part of Dillinger's gang, Dillinger, along with Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, and John Hamilton, had made their escape out the back windows of the lodge. Babyface Nelson, along with his wife, would be in a small cottage next to the main lodge. Instead of fleeing, Nelson opened fire on the FBI, hiding in the pines. The FBI had miscalculated the terrain in the back of the lodge. A small strip of land made a perfect escape route along Little Star Lake. Still not knowing if Dillinger was in the lodge, the FBI fired on the building. By daybreak, tear gas was used, bringing out several girls who had accompanied the Dillinger gang. All in all, the raid was a disaster. Not only did Dillinger and his gang escape, but the FBI managed to wound 2 innocent men and kill a 3rd. It was first reported that barking dogs alerted the Dillinger gang, who promptly started firing on the FBI hiding in the pines. But eyewitness accounts would refute this testimony, and the story quickly changed. The incident at Little Bohemia severely damaged the reputation of J. Edgar Hoover's new FBI. It was privately and publicly wondered if the FBI wasn't more criminal than the criminals it was trying to apprehend. But the FBI would have its day on July 22, 1934, when John Dillinger was shot and killed in an alley outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago. Among the agents present was Melvin Purvis. By 1935, Hoover was upset with Purvis for his notoriety. Gunning down Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd made Purvis a national hero. Hoover would even go so far as to assign agents to spy on Purvis. Hoover and Purvis would become bitter enemies. Purvis retired from the FBI in 1935. On February 29, 1960, the 56-year-old Melvin Purvis, in failing health, would commit suicide. The beginning of World War II brought another boom on the Gogebic Range. The mines were running at full capacity. The Carey and Montreal mines were producing more than ever before, and the demand for steel was unprecedented. But once again, Hurley would be embroiled in controversy. 1942 saw Wisconsin elect a new governor, Walter S. Goodland. Goodland knew Hurley all too well as the former owner and editor of the Ironwood Times newspaper. His views on Hurley could be seen in scathing editorials. If we are not mistaken, Hurley is still part of the United States. Crossing the river is tantamount to crossing to another country with their own laws, own rules, and own people. We at this newspaper call upon the good people of Hurley to clean their own house. Walter S. Goodland. Governor Goodland would now attack gambling establishments in Wisconsin. He feared unregulated gaming establishments were more often than not crooked. His fears were not totally unfounded. Hurley's Silver Street was lined with gambling rooms with quick-handed card dealers, loaded dice, and rigged slot machines. In 1945, Goodland would spearhead a campaign to abolish mechanical gambling devices. The Thompson Law made the slot machine illegal. But in true Hurley fashion, this only served to move the one-armed bandits from the bar room to the back room. By 1950, Hurley was still stubbornly defiant of federal and state laws. Hurley would now relish the press it had detested several years earlier. Slogans and ad campaigns served only to entice tourists to see the now famous Hurley. Saloons were still prevalent on Silver Street. The city had issued more than 78 liquor licenses. Per population, this was more than any town in the United States. But for the citizens of Hurley, life away from Silver Street was very different from the bawdy reputation portrayed for more than half a century. From the very beginning, Hurley would build some of the finest schools in the state of Wisconsin. Its religious community created churches with strong congregations. The majority of citizens were God-fearing, hard-working people who were caught under the shadow of Silver Street. The 1950s saw a steady decline in iron ore production. The mines that had been so important to the economy of the Gogebic Range over the previous 7 decades were now slowing. Jobs were becoming scarce as layoffs began. Imported ore was affecting the market. The workforce and population of the great Gogebic Iron Range was dwindling. By 1958, 18 of the largest producing iron ore mines on the range would close. Like all businesses on the range, Silver Street was affected. No longer would the rush of miners and lumberjacks pour into the saloons. In an effort to provide unique services, Hurley saloons would now delve heavily into prostitution and gambling. The effort would only pay dividends as long as the customers were coming to Silver Street. With the numerous saloons and the decline in population, these establishments would now vie for the money spent on Silver Street. Without regulation of any kind, gambling was fixed, and prostitutes would become professional pickpockets and shills, stealing money from drunk patrons at every opportunity. Customers were often too embarrassed to turn to the law, and for those who did, their complaints would often fall on deaf ears. For the saloons of Hurley, it was a matter of economics. There was just not enough money to support all the establishments on Silver Street. The eventual decline of the Silver Street Saloon was inevitable. The press would continue its relentless onslaught on Hurley, and books would still tout the evil of Hurley's Silver Street and magnify its past. But by the mid-50s, the state and federal governments were keeping close watch on Hurley and its businesses.
For these people, learned everything there is about gambling, learned everything about crooked gambling. So one of the reasons that Hurley didn't survive like all the other towns that would have gambling is because the other towns out west, as they learned in Las Vegas and Reno and Lake Tahoe and New Jersey, these gamblers finally got wise to the fact that the more you give away, the more you're going to get back. And they got wise to the fact that if you start cheating in gambling, it only gets in your way. And that was the problem in Hurley.
Political restructuring forced corrupt officials out of office, and given the new attitude of the country, Hurley, and what made it famous, was no longer acceptable. In April 1955, the state of Wisconsin would start action against several saloons on charges that these establishments were a nuisance and menace to the morals of the community. In November of that same year, 20% of Hurley's saloons faced closing and license suspensions. Hurley was in the midst of a life-and-death struggle. By 1960, 56 taverns were operating, down from 85 a decade earlier. Hurley would still remain popular in the public eye. Stories would continue to circulate throughout the country about its gambling, vice, and disregard for the law. Even Senator John F. Kennedy would visit Hurley during his presidential campaign. The notoriety of Hurley would serve his political purpose and generate much-needed press. The 60s brought change to the Gogebic Range. The steady decline in employment by these once massive mine properties caused small businesses to close their doors. Hurley and Silver Street were not immune. On August 10, 1962, the Montreal mine, after 76 years and 46 million tons of iron ore, would cease operations. The deepest underground iron mine in the world and the second largest producer of iron ore on the Gogebic Range would now let water fill its drifts instead of men. In that same year, the Pinocchio would close. 1963, the Newport. And in 1965, the last iron ore mine in Iron County, the Carey, would close its doors forever. In 1966, the last operating iron ore mine on the Great Gogebic Range, the Peterson in Bessemer, would close. The great iron mines of the Gogebic Range were all gone. By the mid-60s, Hurley would come under scrutiny by its own citizens. It was felt that any chance of survival would hinge on polishing the tarnished reputation of Silver Strait. A movement was soon begun to restrict the prostitution and gambling of the now infamous lower block. But by chance or fate, some of the more notorious saloons on the lower block of Silver Street would fall prey to fire, and most were never rebuilt. But in bold defiance, a few establishments would continue on as they had for the past 80 years. For some Hurley establishments, it was a difficult transition to legal enterprise. What had come so easy years before was now a good deal harder. Although publicly J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI considered Hurley insignificant, Hoover would admit privately that Hurley was a constant thorn in his side. Hurley's exploits were national news and a constant source of aggravation for Hoover. The FBI was often severely criticized for allowing Hurley to continue on the path of damnation, as one article read. Year after year, federal agents raided Hurley's establishments with little or no impact. Its well-publicized failure was primarily due to jurisdictional problems. Local police, prosecutors, and judges were convinced Hurley's illegal operations were necessary evils. The local government had jurisdiction over matters concerning prostitution and gambling. Although Hurley was an embarrassment to Hoover, there was little he could do. The FBI chief could only wait and watch until jurisdiction fell in his court. Unfortunately, Hoover would never live to see that day. He died while still running the FBI in 1972. The FBI had kept a keen eye on Hurley since the late 1920s and was virtually unable to stop the illegal trade on Silver Street. It was hoped that an elected official or public authority would come forth with allegations, or at least somehow slip, opening the door to federal prosecution. That day would finally come for the FBI, but not until 1980. Hurley would be well known for its disregard for the law. Its history is dotted with spats with the federal government. Hurley would amass a record like no other. The federal government would convene a grand jury concerning Hurley, its businesses, and its citizens no fewer than 67 times, setting a record for a town of its size in the United States. The last prostitution-related indictment by a federal grand jury would occur March 18, 1980. A federal grand jury would convene in Madison, Wisconsin, to hear testimony pertaining to prostitution at the Show Bar, one of Silver Street's more colorful nightclubs. Although this may have been just another case of prostitution, the press quickly picked up the story. Their interest was not prostitutes, but who was involved with prostitutes. Iron County Circuit Judge Alex J. Ranieri would now become embroiled in controversy. Although Judge Ranieri would proclaim his innocence and deny all charges, the grand jury would elect to indict him on 5 federal counts: 3 counts of promoting prostitution, 1 count of perjury, and 1 count of threatening a witness. The trial would last for over 3 weeks, and over 60 witnesses were called to testify. The prosecution's case would hinge largely on Ranieri's own grand jury testimony. Although Judge Ranieri would deny purchasing and using plane tickets for himself and a female companion, the prosecution would prove otherwise, also proving his intent to deceive the grand jury. Handwriting experts were called to testify that Ranieri was the actual author of checks used to pay bar bills and prostitutes. And Ranieri, over a 3-year period, would deposit more than $95,000 into personal accounts. On December 18th, After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury would reach a verdict. Iron County Circuit Judge Alex J. Ranieri would be found guilty on all 5 counts. Ranieri was sentenced to Waupun State Prison, 2 years for threatening a witness, 1 year for perjury, and a $15,000 fine for his role in promoting prostitution. The federal government considered the case a success. After 100 years, it had finally exposed corruption and closed a prostitution ring. But the victory was a hollow one. The era of organized prostitution had already come to an end a year earlier, when the show bar had burned down of unknown causes. By the 1970s, Hurley tried to ignore its bawdy reputation and focus on tourism, primarily for sportsmen. The iron mines that had once been the largest employers were no longer operating, and families moved. By 1980, the notorious gambling parlors and brothels were all gone. The more than 80 saloons that had lined Silver Street, one after another, had slowly disappeared. Fire had claimed some, while lack of business claimed others. Hurley's population had dipped to 1,700 people, its lowest since 1885.
I think that Hurley was better than people thought it was. The reputation was, there was a saying, Hurley, Hayward, and hell. And as far as I'm concerned, Hurley was a far cry from hell. And as I said, if you went anywhere looking for trouble, you can find it.
I've always said this about the first block in Hurley. Nobody asks anybody to go there. You know, if you know what it is and you go there, you must want to go there. And I believe that, you know, just between you and I believe it outlived its purpose because, you know, it doesn't belong in a town that has churches and, you know, so forth and so on.
Hurley would go through a new chapter in its history. In 1969, the Pavo Nurmi Marathon was started, attracting thousands every year to Silver Street. With an average yearly snowfall of 160 inches, snowmobiling became a popular sport in the 80s. By 1992, Hurley had now chosen a new direction toward its past. Rather than ignoring it, it would choose to honor it, good and bad.
Before Las Vegas there was Hurley. And Hurley was known from East Coast to West Coast, and I would even venture to say in Europe. I don't know that as a matter of fact, but I know that it was every place I've been. If I said I was from Hurley, everybody knew where Hurley was. And back in the 1920s and 1930s, almost until the Second World War, there were no keys to the taverns because they were open 24 hours a day. And especially in the first block, you had gambling, you had prostitution, and yet it was a clean town. Yeah, things happened, but you didn't have to be afraid to walk down the street. Hurley took care of itself.
But some of what was Hurley still exists. A few gentlemen's clubs remain on the lower block, often raising eyebrows by citizens, and once again getting press. But these clubs no longer cater to local miners and lumberjacks. They survive with the help of winter tourists, and most clubs curtail or close operations in summer months. The community of Hurley would handle these establishments much differently this time. On April 11, 1989, the City Council voted to ban nude activities on Silver Street. Hurley has changed. Places where miners would once meet after work and talk about the old days are now just a memory. Where Lotta Morgan was found in a pool of blood now stands a supermarket. Famous Silver Street now looks much like a street in any other town. And the mighty Montreal River, once reported to have had dead bodies floating in its waters every weekend, seems a bit more calm. As for the little village of Glen Hurley, though for over a century people would come and go, her stories remain.